Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, your weekly foray into the world of banking, finance, insurance, and as always, curated by Monocle Solutions. I'm Michael Avery, and today we're going to franchise it. Franchising is often seen as the economy's quiet compounding engine. Thousands of independently owned nodes all humming in sync, generating good things, generating employment, transferring skills, and contributing close to 1 trillion rand annually to South Africa's GDP. That's more than agriculture, mining, or manufacturing. Yet, despite this formidable footprint, access to funding remains a stubborn gatekeeper holding back inclusive growth and real economic transformation. As South Africa commemorates the inaugural World Franchise Day, we take stock of an industry that's not only proven its post-COVID resilience, but is also so central to addressing our youth unemployment crisis, our spatial inequality, and our entrepreneurial deficit. But if franchising is the engine, finance is certainly the fuel, and I think too often the tank is running dry. Why are banks still hesitant to fund a very proven model? What do franchisors need to change in their unit economics to make franchisees more bankable? And can the new partnership between the Franchising Association of South Africa and SEFTA finally unblock the pipeline? Well, joining me to talk about the franchise funding bottleneck, the business model trends, and the future of franchising in South Africa is none other than Ayabulela Njingolo, who's newly appointed chairman of the Franchise Association of South Africa, FASA, and executive at the OBC Group, one of the country's most successful community-rooted food retail chains. Aya, great to have you on the podcast on this chilly Joburg afternoon. And the numbers tell one story. But before we get into that, maybe you could just share a little bit more about your own journey in franchising and now your role as chairman of FASA.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Michael, and good afternoon, listeners. Thank you for allowing me this platform and the opportunity to share a bit of my passion in terms of the franchising sector. Sure, where do I start? I represent the OBC Group, rather known as OBC Chicken. We are in a butchery franchise chain. And yes, I've been newly elected as FASA's new chairman of the board, be that the youngest chairperson of the board in the country currently. And I've had the opportunity and the support from a lot of my members and a lot of our directors to potentially spearhead the point of transformation and point of inclusivity within the franchising sector. As you may know very well, it's been a part of the country's history for quite some time. And there's been a lot of stumbling blocks and a lot of, obstacles for many individuals looking to try and get into the space. But to touch more on my professional space, I am the full-time accountant or I play the role of an accountant and business developer for the OBC Group, whereby I'm responsible for now the franchising division of the group, whereby I monitor and do data and business analysis for all our franchisees, stakeholders, and as well as our suppliers. And yeah, I'm coming from a very stringent environment, being the finance and accounting space.
Yep.
And I'm sure a lot of people are wondering in terms of how do you make that transition? It hasn't been easy, but one thing I can say for sure is that it requires an open mind, a willingness to learn, and also a willingness to contribute. It's not so much about just sponging up everything that comes in your way, but also look at opportunities where your presence as an individual in a specific sector, not just only franchising, can make an impact that looks at the country holistically and has a 10, 20, or even 30-year plan to address some of the pitfalls and issues that we're dealing with, such as unemployment in the country.
I think it's such a great way to encapsulate what franchising holds in terms of its potential for the country and what can draw an individual into leadership inside the industry to help realize that purpose. What did you study and what drew you into the OBC Group in particular, which was established back, was it the mid-80s, I think? You've got a national network and really one of the fastest growing emerging communities with more than 38 million consumers offering this range of fresh and frozen chicken. But as someone from finance, how did you find your way in that particular path?
Look, at the time I was doing my articles, psycho articles. The objective essentially was to become a CA. Once you get into the industry, you know how it is. From outside, it looks glamorous, it looks great, it looks worthwhile with benefits. But once you get your hands dirty, you roll up your sleeves and do what you need to do. I realized this is not for me. Yes, I have an understanding of finance, I have an understanding of accounting and numbers, but it is not what drives my passion, where I'm more of a businessman. I've always wanted to be a businessman. And I just happened to take finance as the route and as the tools I needed to understand this industry or the space. So essentially, I have a qualification or double major in finance and accounting, CIMA accredited, which is now a Chartered Institution of Management Accounting, which is internationally recognized. And I'm still continuing now with my studies, just to give a perspective that work is not always the way out, but to always have that backing and the necessary knowledge and tools to bring the theory and practical together. And I've found an interest in franchising, or a gap rather, in seeing that, look, it's been held in an industry where it's revolving around the same minds and the same principles and the same execution, that as the youth, I can come in and say, listen, as an individual, as a citizen of South Africa, I can contribute towards the current generation that has no understanding, has no insight of opportunities outside the rudimentary direction of being a professional, such as your doctors, your attorneys, the typical engineers. People assume when you have a specific qualification, you are automatically successful. But I mean, our stats prove us otherwise.
Yeah. Well, we need to almost, and I'm very passionate about entrepreneurship, inculcate an entrepreneurial mindset in high school already. I think, to start to ingrain that in the curriculum. And with a professional tertiary qualification, if you want to go that route, then you align that with an entrepreneurial mindset. And you can have the kind of 1,000 flowers that bloomed in China, for example. I'm always reminded of what Jack Ma said when he came to South Africa. I think it was in 2018. As a guest of President Cyril Ramaphosa. It was one of his first investment conferences. And, Jack Ma built and founded Alibaba, and he did it, very much off his own bat as an entrepreneur. But he said to the president, what we did in China is we made entrepreneurs our everyday heroes. From a cultural perspective, we said entrepreneurship is really the gold standard. And we just understood that you unleash the economic potential of your people and society. As a young, and you're still quite young, Aya, but when you were at home and in school, was entrepreneurship a path that was readily open to you? Was your father in entrepreneurship, or was it something that still seemed quite distant? And the reason I ask that is because I think culturally, we have to do a lot more and be a lot more intentional about how we bridge that gap between the youth and actually seeing a pathway into entrepreneurship.
If I'm being honest with you, I can give you a perspective on what my views and what my take and my approach towards entrepreneurship and what it means to me. So yes, looking at how things are, my father has played quite a pivotal role in terms of guiding me and showing me and giving me a perspective on working corporate, understanding that you will report to a boss every day, and also being able to find something that works for you and digs deep and touches your passion. Being that said, it makes it a lot easier to juggle when you have something that speaks to your heart and that speaks to your passion. So having said that, I've been privy and privileged to the opportunity of having a best of both worlds, which means I was given the opportunity to also try and figure things out in the world and also still figure things out in corporate, as you may know. And hence now, my route in entrepreneurship is accompanied by the structure of education, the structure of professionalism, the structure of corporate, which I can now look at the gray areas or the areas that are not addressed in entrepreneurship and see how do we bridge that gap. And look, it's a massive jump for someone who is used to a certain standard or a certain structure in their lives to now automatically becoming their own boss or becoming an independent, for example. No one can prepare you for that. It's like when you go to school. You go to school to learn the skills to engage with other people and not necessarily the course. But now when you get into the reality of world, it's completely different. What you are taught and what you are made to do and what you are given the opportunity to do are two completely different things. And school can never teach you that. But surrounding yourself with the right individuals, whether it be mentors, whether it be your boss, your manager, or even family members, it can create that opportunity for a lot of South Africans to say, look, cool, they've done this in the corporate space. They've created this capital for us to now venture into a space that could create now not only additional capital, but wealth in a way that is a lot more sustainable, whilst being able to give back to the communities in which we operate in. And I think, like you had said, how China had made the entrepreneur the hero of the economy. I believe South Africa is somewhat in a similar position in the sense that we need to get that message out a lot clearer and a lot sooner, starting from grassroots levels, get kids into the norm of being able to think for themselves, to be able to allow that innovation to add value in what they do on a regular basis, as opposed to now telling them, go to school, find a job, do what your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather did for all his life. We will never create employment in that way. Yes, we create great soldiers. but not enough generals to
Yeah.
help us address some of these issues that are currently plaguing the current economic standing of our country.
Now, let's unpack that for a little bit then. The skills and the systems that create franchising as this great bridge. And
Sure.
it's often lauded for, franchising as a model. It's built in kind of training and skills transfer.
Yes.
So talk to me a
Yes.
bit about how we can then scale this to more meaningfully address South Africa's massive youth unemployment challenge. What is it about the model that is so important when you talk about training and skills transfer in South Africa?
Definitely. Look, it's based on a symbiotic relationship between the franchisor and franchisee. So it's not outright entrepreneurship. If we can look at it from a rational or a racial perspective, we can easily say it's 80% entrepreneurship, 20% guidance.
Yeah.
Why I say that is because the franchisor is not there to just let you run and bump your head. They are there to support you and help you get stable enough to not only empower those around you, but also generate economic benefits in the long run. So, in my opinion, having saying that, the franchise is constantly provided ongoing training, operational support, marketing expertise, and it ensures that the franchisees are well equipped to run their own businesses effectively. So, once eventually a person gets into that business, as the franchisors, we are here now to just guide and give you the best deals towards helping you achieve the most desirable return. I mean, anybody who gets into entrepreneurship knows the reality of it. It is not easy and it's definitely not cheap, not necessarily in a financial aspect, but also from a personal aspect. You contribute to yourself. It's like raising a child. A lot of these business owners would say it's not pap and place, as the term would be in South Africa, but it is an opportunity for those who have the grit, who have the resilience, and have that willingness to become more than what they see happening in the environment. I think it's also just addressing that misconception of what franchising is, because a lot of people think franchising, they think retail. They think fast food and they're like, okay, long hours.
Yeah.
I don't have time to do what I need to do. But franchising is across the board in terms of industries. We've got fuel, we've got HR, we've got medical services, everything that you could potentially think of internationally. And as a South African, or from a context of the South African's perspective, there are franchisees that speak to what we as individuals would like most. And in saying so, franchising allows for a solid transfer of skills because it's an extremely practical industry. And what I mean by that is you're not going to be finding yourself sitting behind a laptop or reading a book on a consistent basis to get a ticket or get a certificate that would now say, look, you're eligible, you're competent enough to do this. No. Franchising gives you the opportunity to run and learn on the go. And with that being said, no one can take what you've learned away from you. And in that point, that's where I see franchising is quite significant in the context of South Africa, when there is quite a few hesitations towards education, youth, empowerment, and also access to information.
In practical
So
terms, what support do new franchisees need in year one, given your experience and what you've seen at OBC Group that often gets overlooked? And how is FASA trying to change that to ensure that we see higher rates of success? What are the success rates with new franchisees?
I'd be lying to you if I said I can speak for all organizations. But I can speak from an OBC perspective and say, look, we've got a 95 to 98% success rate.
Wow.
And it's not often that we do find franchisees that fail, but when they do, it's a combination of things. There's a lot of risk that comes into being an entrepreneur, first of all. Secondly, running a business means not only focusing on one aspect of things, which in our case would be looking at, for example, selling. There's a multitude of disciplines that come into running a business. We're looking at marketing, we're looking at HR, we're looking at financial acumen, business acumen, and also customer care. And the most difficult aspect of getting a consistent supply of successful franchisees is the willingness of also the individual to absorb this information and apply it in the way that would benefit the brand and the individual simultaneously. And I feel, or I believe, that's often miscommunicated with a lot of individuals who've come to brands and said, look, I've got X amount, I would like to get into business. Number one, there's misinformation. Not understanding the business that you're trying to get into is also extremely detrimental. Yes, we may know our big brands, our big QSR brands, our big retail brands and FMCG brands, but do we really know what it takes to run those kinds of businesses? Do you know what it takes to establish the customer base or the market for you to operate in that area? And often people don't have the patience nor the financial resource available simultaneously to attend to these things. As you may know, as individuals, once we get stressed, we tend to fixate on one point as opposed to taking a step back, looking at the horizon of the entire market or the entire industry and executing from that point onwards without having to find ourselves in a position where we need to decommission certain stores. But on an ongoing basis, we do offer quite a bit of support. I've been fortunate enough to understand the business from the ground up. I've opened stores. I've had to sort out stores, At some point, I had to learn how to pack wars.
Yeah. Get your hands dirty. I mean, that's the best way to
understand.
learn. Yeah.
Exactly. Managing people, dealing with staff, dealing with financial institutions, dealing with suppliers, dealing with the head office as well. Seeing that there's so many complications and so many lines of communication that go in. It's a consistently moving model that a person needs to stay on top of. But the fortunate part about it is that it's a model that's, I wouldn't say rather easy to get, but a model that can be applied and taught.
But those success rates are remarkable. I mean, if you just flip it around and if you just look at typical entrepreneurship, it's the other way around. Only 10% of new businesses tend to survive past 2 years, the other 90% failing. The franchise model flips that on its head, given that.
Absolutely.
And when we look at access to funding, many traditional banks still look for collateralized lending. Is this part of the problem, trying to finance franchise expansion with a home loan kind of mentality? And maybe you could just talk to me about that funding gap and what you're seeing in the market at the moment.
Michael, to be honest with you, yes, it is somewhat of a crutch or a handbrake, if I can put it in that regard. Unless you come from money or you've got access to immense capital, it's often difficult to get to the point where you can engage with commercial banks and commercial institutions to say, listen, guys, here's an idea, here's a concept, here's what I own. Can we get into business? That lack of faith of having our own citizens in the country worried by the fact that they need to have existing assets to get into business has been quite crippling on the majority. Irrespective of that being said, it hasn't stopped a lot of institutions from going forward and minimizing some of these requirements to get an individual in. And it's a mix of things, Michael, if I can put it, to be honest with you. As much as a person can wake up and have the fire in their heart, we don't know how long that passion will last. And that is not a guarantee to those financial institutions. And neither is it to the franchisor. But now when we can see a person is willing to put any personal surety towards investing into something that will be sustainable, I guess that's how the banks find a sort of comfort to engage with you. But now this is where we as Foster have stepped in to say, look, it's unreasonable for them to expect a vast majority of the country who have not had access to certain brands, certain assets, and certain potential or possibilities of getting equity or assets or properties, if I can put it like that. We as Fosters come to say, listen, we're engaging with the Department of Small Business Development and we're engaging with CFA. This is for us now to bridge that stumbling block of getting the right individual into business. And this is how we are now ensuring that we even maintain a much higher success rate, not only as a brand, but also as a sector, is by ensuring that we couple the right skills and expertise, which is coming from the franchising sector, the franchisors themselves, and partnering them up with individuals that qualify from an operational perspective and willingness to learn and compassion part of things to say, listen, we're going to get you into business, but we're not going to let you go.
How does that work? How does that risk sharing model, but now that you've got the Small Enterprise Development and Finance Agency entering the picture, how does that risk sharing model between the franchisor, the franchisee, and the funder start to be reimagined? Are we seeing a movement towards cash flow based lending or blended finance? How is that going to work in practice?
To keep it simple, we're looking at a blended model. Hence now the engagement is more private-public, as opposed to it just being a private initiative or just a public initiative.
Right.
I think the biggest issue that we've had in the past is that we have focused on one area of concern and getting that right and executing without the expertise or the necessary tools to sustain it. Starting anything is easy, Michael, to be honest with you. Anybody can get a loan and just start something. It's how you sustain it. It's how you maintain it. It's how you manage your cash flow. It's how you manage that business and how you manage the knowledge you've acquired and putting it into practice and practically applying it in a way that would now essentially benefit you as the individual coming in, whilst also benefiting the environment that you're in. So I'm very excited with government still willing to engage on this point as much as the private sector. It's quite exciting, Michael, to be honest with you. It means now all quote unquote born frees. I fall into that category as well. Have these tools and opportunities to get in and say, oh, okay, whereas it would have cost my parents X millions to get into business, it's costing me maybe far less.
Yeah.
From 10K, 100,000, but at least I'll have that support from the franchisee, and government has my best interest to get me in a space where I could benefit not only myself and my family, but those that are within the space that I operate in,
But there's still, I just understand the model, there's still alignment, because I think the one thing about startups, and you hear about bootstrapping, all of the really sustainable, great entrepreneurs I've interviewed over my career, the one thing they had right up front was alignment. So they had a certain skin in the game initially that helps you develop that kind of discipline. So how is the alignment being brought in while still being mindful of the past and the fact that the past didn't allow the vast majority of South Africans the ability to acquire assets that could be used in a collateralized way? How are you balancing the two to ensure that there is still alignment?
Oh, that's actually quite a tricky question, Michael. But I can talk from a perspective of dealing with some of our franchisees and having some succeed and some not so fortunate to be in a successful position. But then again, it comes down to alignment between the franchisor and the potential franchisee and the willingness to get into the space. Yes, banks have traditionally put an individual responsible for raising some sort of capital or having some sort of assets behind them to ensure that they have that skin in the game. This is now whereby FASA comes in from an ethical perspective to say, listen, there's agreements that we need to put into place that bind the both of us in this marriage.
Right.
I say marriage because it's exactly that.
Yeah.
Between yourself and the franchisor, you're creating a baby, and the baby's your business.
Yeah.
And you can't expect one side to be more responsible than the other. We need to show up, both of us, equally in this way. So as much as capital might be lacking to an extent, which we in the past have also helped franchisees that have potentially, if not potentially, but have currently multiple sites being PDI, we have ensured that we've supported them. And now we've got the NDA in place. We've got the franchise agreements that have been worked on from the inception of FASA. And it's helped us maintain that credibility and also the integrity between the franchise or franchisee.
Yeah.
Yes, there have been one or two ugly divorces in life, like we do get in normal marriages, but it's often due to misunderstanding and also misalignment, as you have mentioned before, from both sides. You may seem initially to be the right candidate or the right individual, but sometimes find yourself later on down the line. Like I said, in my own experience with accounting, I've rolled up my sleeves, I've got to understand the environment, and I found, this is not for me.
Yeah.
So you redirect yourself in that manner.
Looking at the data at your disposal, obviously through OBC and now at FASA, when you look at the funding gaps and where they are most acute for the youth, for first-time entrepreneurs, would you say it's startup capital? Is it working capital, equipment financing, getting those cash flow buffers to ensure that once they're up and running, they can withstand downturns? Not necessarily a COVID-type downturn. I think that's hopefully a once in 100, 200-year event. But where would you say the most pressing funding gaps are that require filling?
Oh, just the startup. It's always a startup, Michael. You know, the hardest thing I've had to see is some of our members who are in the process of franchising existing businesses have found it quite difficult to get that greenfield opportunity to start afresh. And yes, I understand from a perspective of risk management, it's quite a hefty requirement from any kind of financial institution, whether it be private or public, to immediately start from grassroots level and build a business. Henceforth, now with us being in the franchising sector, even then, it's still a risky move, but the risk is a lot more manageable and can be dealt with. And a close second would have to be an understanding of your cash flow. A lot of people that get into business assume your turnover, for example, will be exactly what your take home is, without taking into consideration what your overheads are, what GP is, what your net is, and what are your key fixed costs you need to maintain and stay on top of outside of, for example, your suppliers or your competitors that are currently operating in the same space. So between the two, I would say those are your key financial areas that you need to press and focus on. Essentially, that is the tiger you need to keep your foot on to ensure that you maintain control of not only the investment you have going on, but also potentially looking after the environment.
I've got to ask you, and I mean, cash flow, I think in every business, you know, from the very smallest to very large businesses, I've hosted business rescue practitioners who say You know what, Michael? Often in a big listed company, you know what goes wrong when it goes into business rescue? It was cash flow. It was the fact that the CEO took the CFO on a jaunt for the next shiny M&A deal. They took their eye off the cash flow, the basics of the business.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
a downturn happened and all of a sudden you find yourself in business rescue. So I think cash flow is king no matter what your
Absolutely.
business size, and really important that. But when we just come back to how we plug the startup capital gap, for example, from the franchisor perspective, do you think brands need to rethink their own unit economics and their fee structures to become more funder friendly? Or I've heard of very interesting models, franchise or subsidized models. Some are starting to partially underwrite capex or waive some of the upfront fees. How sustainable might that be to opening the doors to more young first-time entrepreneurs?
Oh, that is very instrumental in terms of retaining a loyal individual who will grow your brand in areas where you might not be able to potentially operate from. Reason being is that, yes, you might have the capital to do the startup and potentially a portion of the cash flow. Great. But there are factors in this country that happen that may cause people to lose cash. For example, we've got load shedding, we've got public unrests, we've got strikes that happen all over the country at any given point in time. And if the franchisor, for example, is to step in and say, look, you've been shut down for a week due to this unnatural event that has been caused within your region, we, for example, as OBC would be able to say, listen, you're stopped for the next 3 weeks. We will cover it. Thereafter, we're giving you so many terms to sort that out, so that we ensure that your cash flow is not disrupted, number one, and the fact that we maintain the reliability and quality of the brand in that said region, irrespective of what has happened. For example, we've been successful and grateful for being able to have majority of our stores untouched by some of the June unrest that happened 2 years ago. We had communities that were protecting some of the shopping centers and some of our stores on our behalf without the request to say, listen, guys, you cannot destroy the very same business that feeds
The
and
community.
employs us.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, not all stores were fortunate in that regard, but we were there and our franchisees were able to engage with the public and the community to say, listen, guys, this is how we've done things. This is how we're holding on to the community. And this is how we give back as an organization. We're not just a big brand that comes in, puts our store, puts our business out there, puts our brand there and not give back. At the same time, knowing that our franchisee might be getting into the space for the first time, we know they don't know everything about the sector. We know they don't know the right suppliers. We know they don't know about the bulk or the direct sales that need to take place. So as the group, we do have our head of operations who does come into place. And from time to time, once the franchisor or the person investing has an idea of what the basics are, we as the franchisee or the franchisors come in as more or less a mentor, business coach to say, look, you're making so much GP, you're making so much turnover. Have you considered approaching low-hanging fruit around your store, your vendor trades, looking at potentially tapping into other businesses that are surrounding you that could potentially be supplied for you, for example? We are there for that advice. We're there for those opportunities. And we are always open to hear from our franchisees. What are the best ways forward? How do we benefit from this mutual marriage? And how do we grow together as individuals? Because one line I can say for a fact that my MD repeats to me on a regular basis is, if you're not making money, we're not making money.
Yeah, exactly. There's alignment. That's what I love about the model, Aya. And you're harnessing that power, the discipline, the drive that capitalism and free markets and the private sector is built on. We've spoken about doing a public-private partnership to bring in some of that risk capital. But a lot of the conversation in South Africa at the moment, when it comes to how we seed Black entrepreneurs and how we create more Black entrepreneurs, has been seized with this 100 billion rand transformation fund. And not everyone thinks it's a good idea. People worry about centralizing that amount of money. Let's face it, our history with, corruption is not a good one. But should there be an industry push for a dedicated franchise development fund, one that takes a longer term view on returns and impact, especially for township and rural based businesses and concepts? Wouldn't that be a far more effective way of trying to create more Black entrepreneurs, given that the model has proven itself, it's scalable, it's highly repeatable, you've got this mentor-mentee approach, all of these guardrails? What is FASA doing to help seed this idea in the public square? Because I think that would be something that most businesses would be able to get behind if it's well managed and independently managed.
To be honest with you, Michael, I can tell you from my perspective, I think it's a great initiative because I find myself in the private sector outright. And I've seen the pitfalls and I've seen the opportunities and I've seen some of the threats, weaknesses, as well as the strengths of this environment. And I can tell you now, the opportunities and strengths are way more abundant than what the weaknesses and threats are. And having said so, it's based off sustainable model to say, listen, guys, we can get you into business. The business works. We have existing references for you to go look into. It just comes down to finding and partnering with the right individual who's prepared to carry a majority of the risk that the previously disadvantaged individual might not necessarily have access to or knowledge on. And as FASA and the association holding their hand to say, listen, as much as you may see this, this is how we as FASA are going to help you implement and get stable. So we are there on the basis of ensuring that the funding is presented in a transparent manner, knowing that it's not money that's coming to the association directly. It's going directly towards establishing units that will now replicate and help within those areas and those economies such as the township and building on that. I mean, in this country, we have so many brilliant individuals, whether it be youth or not, whether it be PDIs or not. It's just a matter of alignment. Again, touching on that point, you can give anyone money. It takes the right partnerships and it takes the right individuals working towards the same common goal for us to ensure there's this sustainability. And being an individual or a PDI myself, from that perspective, it's easier for me to come to the existing market and saying, listen, I understand looking at how our history has panned out as a country, here's the opportunity from the ashes. How can we now band together and start focusing towards building this? Then I'm sitting in the seat of being in corporate from a retailer franchisor's perspective and saying, guys, here's an opportunity. Here's an individual. He might not necessarily have the qualifications, but this is his track record on being innovative and also potentially engaging on business forums, or not necessarily forums, but business, more or less items that derive from business activities within this country. And that's where now it becomes pivotal for us to outreach to the public to identify these individuals. It's more of a handpicking exercise, which will take time, but it'll be worthwhile. The objective is not to get as many people in business. It's about getting the right kind of people in business. With the right kind of individuals, we can always expand. We can always do better, and we can always identify more and better opportunities, not only as individuals, but as a sector within the constitution of this country and context of South Africa.
Yeah, very good point, Aya. Not everyone is cut out for entrepreneurship at the end of the day. We can't just say that we're going to create another million Ayas, but finding the right individuals, the right jockey, you can scale sustainably. And I think you've just made a very compelling pitch. If you were sitting across from a banker or an investment committee pitching franchising as an asset class or portfolio category. But just before I say goodbye, and you did mention in a statement that FASA released that cutting red tape is critical as well. So what would you say are some of the regulatory red tape pain points that are currently choking the industry that you'd like to see government come to the party on to help free up the latent potential that still sits within the franchising industry in South Africa?
Looking from a government perspective, I can tell you now, seeing that we are very high in terms of the HR aspect of things from our store levels, would have to be our labor laws would need to be relooked at, tax regulations, and industry-specific legislation. You'll find that some of the sectors in which franchising is prevalent, we are taxed extremely high. There's a lot of costs that come into play. And also just maintaining of the infrastructure. Funny you say this. I had this discussion with my MD recently, and he mentioned, you know what, the best thing that could happen now, let government allow the private sector to jump in and address these pitfalls in a manner that would not necessarily remove them from the function, but rather help them grow more. I mean, if we can look at addressing some of the labor issues, we could look at creating more efficient businesses. I mean, dealing with individuals who are purposefully meeting the minimum requirements of what is required of them has forced a lot of companies to run into the ground, unfortunately, based off the fact that people are aware of what is expected of them, but no one is willing to go over and beyond. But in that saying so, yes, as much as the labor laws do protect them in that regard, it does not necessarily protect the businessman or the franchisor or franchisee.
that's what works in the American economy, which is often held up as, one of the best in the world. During a downturn,
Yes.
you may lose
Yes.
jobs, but you don't lose businesses. Businesses are allowed
Absolutely.
to expand and contract as the economic fundamentals change. And in South Africa, you are wedded to a fixed cost structure that will often sink you through a
Yes.
downturn.
Michael, look at it. Our tax is not as bad as I would say the international standard. I think we have it quite decent. But I believe we could get more incentives towards business that are looking towards empowering and adding more value. I mean, for example, recently we had issues with load shedding, and diesel is taxed extremely high in this country. I mean, for retailers, for businesses that rely on backup power generation, it could have helped for government to reduce the tax rating on businesses that are consuming X amount of liters of fuel, diesel, be it so. That could have added towards now potentially expanding a business rather than having to potentially operate from a point of break even.
Ayabulela Njingolo, Chairman of the Franchise Association of South Africa and Executive at OBC Group, thank you for a wide-ranging and optimistic view of how franchising can truly become a lever for economic inclusion and innovation in South Africa. Well, that's all for this edition of the Monocle Banking Podcast. Remember to like, subscribe, and share with your networks. Until next time, I'm Michael Avery. Keep building.